waiting around at this late hour, and we apologize for the length of the testimony today, but as you can imagine, there was a lot of questions that the committee members had that they felt appropriate to ask Mr. Drewniak, and I think that the testimony today, in an interesting way, moved the body of knowledge that the committee has a lot farther down the field. We know today, based on this testimony, that this issue of the closure of lanes on the George Washington Bridge and the discussion about whether or not there was a traffic study was in, according to the words used by Mr. Drewniak, in the front office bloodstream as early as late October. That was his testimony today, and he said that there was a level of knowledge, as explaining what he meant by it being in the bloodstream. There was a level of knowledge in the governor's office. He talked about having talked to Charlie McKenna, one of the governor's attorneys, about this issue. That's a very serious step for an issue that he also testified was not something that he thought rose to a very serious level. What this testimony says to me is it calls into question the timeline that's been enunciated in the past about what the governor's office knew and when they knew it. What it says to me is that we all knew at that point in time that the subpoena power that the Assembly Transportation Committee had would expire in a very short period of time, and there's even mentions in the documents that we have through the Gibson-Dunn interviews that there was an effort to run out the clock. And so it seems that while this was in the bloodstream of the governor's office as early as October, there was an effort apparently to run out the clock. Senator Weinberg?
Yeah, and I think it adds to what the environment was like and who knew what when. You know, I keep coming back, the executive director of the Port Authority on October 2nd, his email hit the press. Laws were broken, federal and state laws. And the attitude was, well, Pat Foy hates David Wildstein. So then the next conclusion was supposed to be he made up that email because he hates David Wildstein. Nobody, no one, took the time to look into what really was going on here. They went into damage control. And they went into damage control. In fact, Mr. Drewniak said he spoke to the governor's chief counsel, who told him the chief counsel, was looking into this. So it just bears out more of the questions I've had since the beginning of this. Why didn't somebody, a commissioner on the Port Authority, a chief counsel to the governor's press secretary, the governor's chief of staff, why didn't one of them actually find out and ask the questions, what happened here? Why did somebody make up a traffic study? And I keep going back to the fact if there are no dedicated lanes, there can't be a traffic study, because that's what they claimed the traffic study was about. So why didn't one of these high-level people who knew about this, who claimed they were looking into it, we even have the email which was pointed out today from Regina Agia, who I believe is supposed to be the governor's incoming chief of staff, saying we're sticking to the script. It's all under review. But the fact is, nobody of any of these aforementioned actually launched a review. All they did was move into damage control. I believe we've heard that from other witnesses, and we certainly heard it today.
Any questions?
John, can you run through the timeline again? The Transportation Committee subpoena power was going to end.
The Transportation Committee had subpoena power under two separate resolutions in the last legislative session. All of those resolutions expire with the end of the session, which ended January 13, 2014.
Chairman, Mr. Drewniak testified today that Wildstein said that the bridge closure was his idea, the lane closures was his idea. Do you think that that resolves who was the architect, the mastermind of this?
Well, we have one person saying that he heard from David Wildstein that it was his idea. We also heard testimony that David Wildstein got approval or heard from somebody about, and wasn't really clear the language, but it certainly implied that somebody above his pay grade knew about this, and he implied that there was sign-off. And so what we don't know is that while David Wildstein may have been the architect of it, he believes he got authorization from somebody to do this. We don't know who that is, and that's what we're trying to find out.
Yes, with that in mind, to get to that answer, I'm wondering if there's been any more thought given to what Judge Jacobson said about writing more narrow and scope subpoenas for Kelly and for Stepien. Has there been any movement on that front? Do you have any intention?
Council is working on it. We are hopefully going to get a first draft of that. It's turning out to be a very complicated and intricate exercise to follow the language of Judge Jacobson's ruling and to craft a subpoena that potentially procures useful information. So we have counsel working on that, and hopefully we'll understand very shortly whether or not that's going to be a successful endeavor.
So there is still a possibility that we could get documents from everyone?
Well, there's a possibility that we'll issue a subpoena. Let's take it one step at a time.
Senator Weinberg, can you address a little bit why Pat Schuber has been called in to testify in a couple of weeks?
Yes, I think it's time that we hear from one of the commissioners on the Port Authority. I wanted to hear from Pat Schuber because he's the person I directed my letter to. He's the person I had the phone conversation with, who said to me, I will get to the bottom of this and I will get back to you. So I would like to find out whether anybody, starting with Commissioner Pat Schuber, actually did anything to try to get to the bottom of it. So I think it's important that we hear from some of the top levels at the Port Authority. And may I say, and when I talked about Regina Agia's email, that's exactly what even Pat Foy said to me at each meeting of the Port Authority that I went to. His words, and I would go directly up to him. He's almost as tall as my colleague here, and look up and say, when am I going to get an answer? And his stock answer was, it's under review.
Brian, I just wanted to follow up on that too, because there's a pattern that at least I'm seeing here, in which there are a number of people who are confronted with a set of facts that they're uncomfortable with. We heard back in December from Mr. Fulton and Durando, both who testified that while they were ordered to do this, they thought it was odd, they thought it didn't follow protocol, and they also said that they didn't want to tempt fate, was the words they used, meaning that they were afraid for their jobs. We heard last week from Christine Renno when she was asked, why didn't she go up the food chain to counsel's office to say, hey, I've been asked to delete an email. And her answer was roughly along the same lines, that she really did not want to tempt fate. She was afraid that something would happen to her job. And then you look at, and I had the privilege of going with Senator Weinberg to a Port Authority Commissioners meeting. Now you've got 3 legislators who get up and make comments about this issue, as well as a freeholder from Bergen County, and nobody engaged any of us in any dialogue about what was going on. And so this conspiracy of silence seems to speak to an issue where there was a mentality that you shouldn't rock the boat. You shouldn't raise issues or engage in debate or dialogue about things that potentially were uncomfortable. And you could see that with commissioners, you can see that with employees, and you can see that with Christine Renno last week. And so one of the things that's troubling about this, as well as the timeline being pushed back now into October, is that this administration, whether it's in the Port Authority or in the front office, seems to have had a very chilling effect on individuals who thought maybe they should speak up, or if they saw something, that they should say something, and that clearly didn't happen, and that's troubling in and of itself.
Chairman, some of your Republican colleagues, prior to the start of this thing, say it's time to let the Attorney General, law enforcement do its investigation, question the value of spending $1 million on these hearings.
Well, the total so far is about $780,000, and we know that the Gibson-Dunn report for 3 weeks cost $1.1 million. We don't know what the final toll is. So when we're talking about comparing the expenditures, we need to be fully accurate. The one thing that I have to point out, not only is our mission here distinctly different than what law enforcement, we don't have a goal as a prosecution, we have a goal of fact-finding. And the distinction that's important is that when law enforcement, through a grand jury process or any other process, starts their fact-finding, they may issue an indictment, they may follow through on a prosecution, and they may let us know what they found. But it's not a guarantee. And so we would be remiss in our responsibilities as legislators in doing our fact-finding if we were to just sit back and say, law enforcement will do this work for us, because we may not ever have the answers to the questions we need.
Being is now reached back into October. Are there plans to a subpoena for a testimony of former counsel McKenna and Regina, the incoming chief of staff, and who headed up the authorities unit? It has seemed that the most interesting new stuff was only two of them today.
Well, I think that it's fair to say that there's a universe of names that have come up in all of the documents that you're aware of and in all of the discussions that have been held, and that all of those names are potentially a fair area of inquiry for the committee. We've laid out our schedule at the moment through June 3rd. As we proceed through this, believe me, we are taking notes and evaluating and assessing where we're going to go next. We haven't made any final decisions, but clearly we have a new document subpoena out just the other week to Mr. Duhame. We'd like to see what those documents reveal. We do have individuals set up, including Mr. Mowers, Mr. Schuber, Mr. Foy, in the coming weeks. I'd like to see what their testimony reveals, and then we can continue in evaluating who should come next.
We've heard today, do you have any questions about whether Mr. Drewniak should still serve as the governor's press secretary, or any opinion on that?
I don't have an opinion. That's a question for the governor. Clearly, his role seemed to have modified somewhat pre-January 8th to post-January 8th. That seems to be coming back to the more normal format as it had been before then. So there was some period of time in there in which he seemed to be not out front, if you will. That's a question, though, you have to ask the governor as to whether he feels he's effectively served by Mr. Drewniak. I can't opine on that. Any other questions? Thank you all very much.